Welcome back, boils and ghouls. I know a lot of you might be wondering why I chose to painstakingly attempt to restore the audio and upload a radio program from almost 75 years ago today. Well, I wanted to provide a little introductory video where I explain some of the significance of what you're going to be listening to, as well as offer some meager perspective on the topics being discussed. I put together a rather extensive reading list of sources, articles, and introductions for basically everyone involved, as well as any and all topics mentioned or discussed in this March 2nd, 1948, America's Town Meeting of the Air radio program entitled What's Wrong with the Comics, which can be found in the description below here, as well as in the Town Meeting episode description itself as well. This broadcast would provide the basis for John Mason Brown's famous anti-comics article, The Case Against the Comics, which consisted of edited content from his numerous speeches here, including the famous comic books are, quote, the marijuana of the nursery speech. And ultimately, this radio program is a perfect time capsule of the moment when things started to really go south for comics. People began to believe that by definition there were good comics and bad comics. Completely unfounded as that sort of wild supposition about the comics industry as a whole might be, it's repeated here verbatim and by the one man on the dais that actually publishes comic books nonetheless, George Heck. For most people today, defender of comics Al Capp, the creator of Little Abner and longtime Frank Frazetta collaborator, is going to really be the only name that you'll recognize. George Heck was, however, a comics publisher of some note, not to mention a staunch believer in comic book self-censorship. Later in the same year, in 1948, he would later become one of the founding members of the short-lived and highly ineffectual American Comic Book and Magazine Publishers Association, or ACMP, a direct precursor to the Comics Code Authority, which unsuccessfully tried to implement a code of conduct for participating comics. The opponent of comics, John Mason Brown and Mario Manis, do an excellent job at summarizing what the public opinion of comics was at the time. Author and critic John Mason Brown is in fact a near perfect example of how the public's opinion was swayed by a bevy of smooth-talking snake oil salesmen. He's animated and engaging, clever and beguiling, and quite amusing at times. His not inconsiderable talents at persuasion would likely have threatened to completely overtake the night's proceedings had it not been for the inimitable Al Capp. For if Brown is talented and funny, then Al Capp is spellbinding and hilarious, and truly listening to Capp is beguiling. George Heck is, on the other hand, about as enthralling as listening to your grandfather wheeze cheesy prepared statements from his iron lung in between breathing treatments. While Heck is another supposed comic book supporter and does dedicate considerable time attempting to defend comic books in a sort, mostly their potential as teaching aids, he's just as eager to toss fellow publishers under the bus for what he considers unfavorable material. If boring and somewhat unlikable though, George Heck has Mario Manis beat hands down. Manis comes off as so scripted, frigid, and unlikable that it's difficult to imagine anyone being swayed by anything that she has to say. If, however, you do manage to stay awake for her diatribes against comic books, she does do a wonderful job of advancing the agenda laid out some 8 years before by the Sterling North article, A National Disgrace, which itself had sparked a national debate about comics starting with its publication in 1940. A National Disgrace laid out a systematic plan of attack on the comic book industry, which has basically been continued for the better part of the next 70 years without much deviation. Discontent had been brewing among parents, critics, and especially rival publishers concerning comic books of questionable content since even before North's article in 1940, 8 years prior to this radio program, were finally beginning to boil to the surface. Enough commotion had been created by this point in 1948 by National Disgrace and other articles like it that there was beginning to be widespread outcry among avid comic book readers, advocates, and publishers who felt that comic books were being unfairly singled out. This debate for freedom of speech would eventually culminate in the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency in 1954, which in turn would create the Comics Code Authority, who effectively snuffed out the better part of the existing comic book industry at that point. With that in mind, let's continue down the road to the Senate subcommittee hearings and join our previously scheduled radio broadcast, What's Wrong with the Comics, already in progress, here on WJRK, Jerk Radio, all jerk, all the time.